My husband said, "I don't need you," and left. 3 months later, he was at my door crying. Camille Watkins was 39 years old. The evening, her husband stood in their hallway with a rolling suitcase and delivered 4 words with less feeling than a grocery list. To the world that passed by their front door in the Glenwood South neighborhood of Raleigh, North Carolina. She was unremarkable in all the ways people use that word when they mean small. She drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard and a back seat permanently occupied by project folders. She packed her own lunches in containers she labeled herself with masking tape and a black marker. She wore her hair natural and her clothes practical, and she did not make noise when she entered rooms. Her husband's friends called her Quiet Camille, and when they said it, the word quiet carried a weight that was not quite a compliment, and he never corrected them. What none of them had ever thought to ask, what her husband Marcus had not once in 7 years of marriage considered worth investigating, was whose name sat on the deed to the building they were standing in, or the 3 others she owned outright in 2 counties, or why her financial advisor called her every quarter with numbers that had nothing to do with the joint checking account Marcus monitored like a register. He left on a Tuesday with $11,400 transferred out of their shared account over the 2 weeks prior. Incremental enough to look like routine spending, calculated enough to be something else entirely. He stood in the hallway with his suitcase and he said, "I don't need you anymore," in the same tone he used to decline dessert, and then he closed the door with the quiet certainty of a man who believed he had just made a clean exit from a building that belonged to him. He had never once asked whose name was on the insurance policy. He had no idea. What happened in the weeks that followed would cost him every single thing he thought he was walking toward. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came through the kitchen windows the way it always had in this house, settling in wide pale bands across the terracotta tile countertop, moving with the hour the way light does when a room is oriented correctly and the windows are the right size. Camille Watkins stood at the kitchen island with both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, not yet drinking, just holding it, the way her father had always held his at the start of a long day. He used to say that the first quiet moment of the morning was the only honest one, that it was the only window of time before the world got its hands on you and started negotiating what you were worth. She had carried that with her the way she carried most of what he left her, quietly, without announcement, like load-bearing infrastructure that nobody noticed until it was the only thing still standing. She had laid these kitchen tiles herself. Not as a weekend hobby, not as a home improvement project she watched a video about, as a deliberate act of ownership. 3 weekends in the spring of the previous year, kneeling on this floor with a level and a rubber mallet and a bucket of adhesive, measuring twice before every placement, getting it exactly right, because that was the only way she knew how to do anything. Her husband Marcus had stood in the doorway on the second afternoon and asked if she needed help, and she had looked up from the floor and said no thank you, and she had meant it, and he had shrugged and wandered back to the living room, and she had kept working. Spanish terracotta, 12 by 12, sourced from a warehouse she had driven to in person to select the lot herself. Her father would have nodded at that. He had been a structural engineer for 33 years and deeply constitutionally unimpressed by shortcuts, and Camille had inherited from him both the credential and the disposition. She had gotten her degree from NC State at 24, started at a small civil firm in Durham, and worked the kind of hours in her late 20s that her mother called frightening and she called necessary. By 32, she had her own firm. 3 people, then 6, then 12. She did commercial structures, mixed-use developments, load analysis for renovation projects. She was precise, and she was fast, and she was almost never wrong, and the contractors who worked with her regularly did not explain things to her twice. She had also, over the course of her career, used a portion of her income to acquire property, not dramatically, not all at once, but methodically, the way her father had taught her to approach any long-term structural problem. 4 buildings over 8 years. She had never mentioned this to Marcus, not because she was hiding it exactly, but because he had never asked about her finances with any real curiosity. And she had grown up in a household where her father said that a woman who knew her worth did not negotiate it down for the comfort of someone else's understanding. Marcus Delaney had come into her life at a mutual friend's cookout in the summer when she was 32 and not looking for anyone particular. He had brought a potato salad that was genuinely remarkable, and he had laughed easily and freely, and he had asked her questions about structural engineering with the specific attention of someone who was actually interested rather than making conversation, and she had found that uncommon enough to pay attention to. He was warm. He was present. He called when he said he would. For the first 2 years, he had been exactly who he appeared to be, and she had been grateful for it in the quiet, understated way she was grateful for things, without spectacle, without ceremony. Like a building that settles correctly into its foundation and you simply do not hear from again. They married in a small ceremony in her Aunt Dolores's backyard in Concord on a warm October afternoon. Her father was still alive then. He gave a toast that made 19 people cry, including 2 contractors who had known Camille for a decade and would not have described themselves as the kind of men who cried at weddings. Marcus kissed her like he meant every word of it. She had no idea he had already begun measuring the distance between who she was and what he had decided he deserved. The first signal she registered but did not yet name came 8 months before he left. A key on his key ring that she did not recognize. Small, silver, generic, the kind cut at any hardware counter in 20 minutes. She noticed it one evening when he set his keys on the kitchen island and turned to answer his phone, and she looked at the key and said nothing, and placed the observation in the part of her mind where she kept things she was not yet ready to examine. She was an engineer. She had learned from 30 years of professional practice that you did not pull on a structural anomaly until you understood what it was attached to. You cataloged it. You watched. You waited. The waiting ended on a Wednesday afternoon in March when she came home 2 hours early from a project site because the afternoon inspection had been pushed by the contractor. She had pulled into the driveway and cut the engine and noticed an unfamiliar car parked half a block down. A white Audi she had never seen before. She sat in her own car for a moment, looking at it. Then she carried her bag inside. She set her keys on the hook. She heard nothing unusual, and then the quality of the silence changed in the way that silence changes when a house is not as empty as it's pretending to be. And then she heard something that was not silence at all. Her hands did not shake. She moved through the front of the house with the same measured calm that had always defined her in situations requiring precision. She did not announce herself. She walked to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water from the tap and stood at the counter and listened and understood and put the glass down. She was a structural engineer. She knew the exact sound of a load-bearing wall that had been compromised quietly over time. She recognized the shape of something that had been pretending to hold. She walked back through the front door. She sat in her car. She was not crying. She had not yet decided what she was going to do, which was different from not knowing. She was thinking. She was filing. She was building a timeline in her mind with the same methodical process she used to evaluate a site before she ever put pen to paper. She drove to the hardware store. She bought a box of 12mm screws and a tube of exterior caulk for a job site she was managing the following week. She drove back 30 minutes later. The white Audi was gone. Marcus was in the kitchen in a fresh shirt, opening the refrigerator with his back to the door, and when she walked in, he turned and smiled, a full and easy smile, and said he hadn't expected her home early, and she said the inspection was pushed, and she asked how his afternoon was, and he told her something about a showing that hadn't gone well, and she listened to every word, and her expression gave him absolutely nothing at all. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her. She made dinner. She ate. She asked a follow-up question about his work. He answered. She washed the dishes. She was watching him the way a structural engineer watches a wall that has already cracked, not with alarm, with documentation. That night, after he fell asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop in the dark. They had set up a shared family email account 2 years into the marriage for joint bills and household logistics. He had never changed the password. She was not proud of what she found, but she was not surprised either. 14 months of a continuing thread with a woman named Vanessa Cruz. Dinner reservations. Hotel confirmations. Wire transfers, 7 of them, in amounts between $800 and $2,000, spread across 13 months and labeled in his bank memo field with shorthand she recognized as deliberate obfuscation. Language in the messages that was easy and practiced in the way that language becomes when two people have been using it long enough to stop performing for each other. She did not read every word. She forwarded what she needed to a private email account she had maintained independently for years. She opened their joint banking portal and exported statements going back 24 months. She opened a spreadsheet. She cross-referenced dates. She built a timeline item by item, transfer by transfer, with the same structured documentation process she used when she was preparing a project for permitting review. The $11,400 she would count later had company. The pattern was disguised as irregular household expenses, but it was consistent enough in its intervals to reveal intention to anyone who looked carefully. She looked carefully. She opened a folder on her laptop. She named it simply Delaney. She picked up her phone and called one person. "I need to come by tomorrow," she said quietly. "I need an hour of your time." The voice on the other end said, of course. No questions, no preamble. That was why she had chosen Patricia Osai as her attorney 11 years ago when she first started acquiring property, and why the choice had never required revisiting. Patricia's office was on the 9th floor of a building in downtown Raleigh with east-facing windows that let in a morning light that felt calibrated to produce clarity. She was 63 years old, had practiced family and civil law for 35 years, and had not raised her voice in a courtroom since 1998 because she had not needed to. She reviewed everything Camille had brought: the forwarded correspondence, the exported statements, the spreadsheet timeline, and she set it down and looked across the desk with the expression of a woman who had seen worse and handled it the same way regardless. "This is not complicated," she said. "This is just work." She walked Camille through what the next steps would look like. The joint account transfers constituted financial misconduct. The 4 properties Camille owned independently, 3 of which had been purchased before the marriage, and 1 of which had been purchased with independent funds during the marriage and was documented as such, were not marital assets under North Carolina law. The prenuptial agreement Marcus had signed at the advice of his own attorney, who had reviewed it quickly and apparently incompletely, protected far more than Marcus had understood when he signed it. Patricia said she wanted to bring in a forensic accountant she had worked with for 16 years to examine the bank records more thoroughly before any filing took place. Camille said that sounded right. Preparation is the work. 3 days later, Camille drove out to Concord and sat at Aunt Dolores' kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon. Dolores was her father's older sister, and she was 76 years old. And she had hands that looked like her brother's hands, wide-palmed and unhurried, and she had sat at Camille's father's bedside for the last 9 weeks of his life without missing a single day. She listened to everything Camille told her without interrupting once, which was its own kind of love. When Camille finished, Dolores was quiet for a long moment. "Your father used to say," she began, "that the people who underestimate you have already counted themselves out. They just don't know the exact date yet." She looked at Camille with the particular focus of someone who has watched someone grow up and knows exactly who they are underneath every version they've worn. He was talking about contractors when he said it, but it applies. Then she said one more thing, and she said it carefully. She told Camille that Marcus had called her Dolores about 5 months before, asking general questions about whether Camille had come from family money, whether there were assets Dolores knew about. She had told him she didn't involve herself in Camille's finances. She had meant to call Camille afterward. She hadn't known how to frame it, and she had let the weeks go by, and she was sorry for that. Camille reached across the table and held her aunt's hand and told her there was nothing to be sorry for. She was watching. She was always watching. The forensic accountant Patricia retained produced his findings in 4 business days. They were specific and orderly and legally cooperative in ways that exceeded what Camille had already found. Marcus had not only transferred funds from their joint account. He had also, on 2 separate occasions, submitted refinancing applications on a rental property that was solely in Camille's name, a building she had purchased with her own savings 14 months before they ever met. The signatures on both applications were not hers. The notary on one of the documents shared a last name with Vanessa Cruz. The accountant noted this without editorializing. He also noted that the full value of funds improperly transferred or leveraged without authorization, when calculated in total, came to $38,000. He laid it out in a table with columns and dates and memo references, the kind of document that did not require interpretation because it did not leave room for any. He had been planning it for nearly 2 years. The week before he left, Camille went home and made a roast chicken with roasted root vegetables, Marcus's preferred Sunday meal, on a Tuesday because she felt like it. She asked him about the commercial listing he had mentioned the week prior. She refilled his water glass. She listened to him talk about a difficult client with the patience of a woman who had nothing on her mind but dinner. He was relaxed. He told a story that made her smile, and she smiled, and she meant it in the sense that she recognized its humor while filing everything else away in the quiet structure she had been building with both hands for 30 days. Real power operated in quiet rooms. Marcus left on a Tuesday. He had prepared a speech in the way that people prepare speeches when they want what they are saying to feel inevitable rather than personal. He said he had been unhappy for some time. He said they had grown in different directions. He said that what they had was real once, but that he needed something more. He said, near the end, as if it were a minor logistical point, that he intended to retain the joint account balance and that he had already spoken with an attorney about the rental property, which he considered partly his given the years of contribution he had made to the household. He said this with the smooth confidence of a man who had done the math and believed it came out in his favor. Then he said he didn't need her anymore, and he picked up his suitcase and closed the door behind him. He did not know that Patricia had already filed that morning. The mediation conference room was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Raleigh 11 days later. Gray carpet, long table, chairs that were designed to feel neutral. Marcus arrived with his attorney, a man Camille recognized as competent but not thorough. Marcus sat down across from her and looked at Patricia, and then looked at Camille, and then looked at the stack of folders at Patricia's elbow with the specific wariness of a man who had expected a different configuration of things in the room. Patricia did not make a speech. She laid the documents on the table the way a contractor lays out a blueprint, with the confidence of someone who built the thing. The bank records first, the timeline spreadsheet, the forensic account report with its columns and dates, then the refinancing applications side by side, the signatures, and the certified handwriting comparison she had obtained from an expert Patricia had used in 3 prior cases, which described with measured clinical language the ways in which the signatures did not match Camille's authenticated samples. Then a letter from the district attorney's office acknowledging receipt of the fraud referral. Marcus's attorney looked at the handwriting comparison for a long time. Then Patricia described, in plain language, what North Carolina law provided for in cases of fraudulent conveyance and unauthorized use of a spouse's identity in financial transactions. She described the 4 properties that would remain solely in Camille's name as they had always legally been. She described the restoration of the joint account. She described the terms under which the DAS referral might or might not proceed, and what cooperation might mean for the shape of that outcome. Marcus looked up from the documents and looked at Camille directly for the first time in the meeting. She watched the arithmetic working its way across his face, the specific calculation of a man realizing precisely how wrong he had been, and how long he had been wrong, and how much of what he thought was happening was not what was happening at all. He said her name. He said he hadn't understood. He said, if he had known, you had 7 years, Camille said. Her voice was level and unhurried, the way it was when she was reading load tolerances on a project site. You decided what you wanted to see, and you saw it. That choice is yours. It was always yours. She placed her copies of the documents into her bag with the same deliberate care she used for anything she intended to keep. I am not angry, she said, standing. I am clear. Those are very different things, and I need you to understand that I know the difference. She walked out of the conference room. She did not look back. The door closed behind her with a sound that was not dramatic, just final. She had built everything worth keeping. 4 months passed the way water moves over stone, not loud, not dramatic, just continuously and in one direction. Camille stood on the porch of her home on a Saturday morning in July with coffee in both hands, watching the Japanese maple she had planted in the side yard at the beginning of Springfield out into the full shape it would hold for the rest of the summer. She had planted it herself on a cool April afternoon, working the soil with a long-handled spade she had owned for 15 years, placing it exactly where the morning light would find it first. The porch boards were new. She had replaced 4 of them herself in May, pressure-treated pine, sanded and sealed. The work had taken one afternoon and a borrowed miter saw, and she had found it satisfying in the simple and absolute way that physical work done correctly is always satisfying. Her firm had taken on the lead on a mixed-use development in the South End, 4 city blocks, the kind of project that came along once in a decade for a firm of her size, and had come to her because a developer she had worked with 3 years prior had insisted to his partners that there was only one engineer he trusted to get it right. The contract represented $2.3 million in billings over 18 months. She had accepted it the way she accepted things that were simply the result of years of preparation meeting years of work, without theater, without announcement. There was a man named Elisha who sometimes sat on the porch with her in the mornings. He was a civil engineer she had met at a project coordination meeting in February, quiet and methodical, and the way that engineers who actually understood their field tended to be. He had asked her good questions about lateral load distribution during that first meeting, and then 6 weeks later had asked whether she had a preference in coffee, and she had told him she did, and they had talked for 2 hours in a way that felt like no time at all. He was not performing for her. He did not explain things she already knew. He laughed at things that were actually funny. She appreciated all of this in the specific way you appreciate something you did not realize you had been missing until it was simply there. She had heard about Marcus in the passing way she heard about things she was no longer tracking. Her Aunt Dolores mentioned it on a Sunday call, not with relish, just as information. That referral had resulted in a plea to a misdemeanor fraud charge that his attorney had worked down from the original counts. But the professional consequences had moved on a different track. When the forensic findings became part of the public record during the civil proceedings, his firm had initiated their own internal review. And he had resigned before its conclusion. He was working in residential property management now. Vanessa had relocated. His mother, according to the woman who told Dolores, was not returning his calls. Dolores reported all of this and then said she imagined Camille was doing well. Camille said she was doing fine. She let the conversation turn to other things. On the porch that July morning, she pressed her fingertips against the warm ceramic of the mug and watched the maple tree move in a small, easy wind that came up from the street and moved through the yard and was gone. Her father had told her once, near the end when he still had the energy for the longer thoughts, that the only honest measure of a life was what you could stand behind once everything else had been stripped away. Not what you had accumulated, not what people thought you had, what you had actually built, with your actual hands, in the actual world. She thought he had been right about that, the way he was right about most things that turned out to matter. The morning was quiet. The maple held its shape in the light. She was free. She was solvent. She was unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.